review before we quite get there. So, and we did our study questions just a little different than we normally do. And I thought we might touch back on the discussion questions very briefly at the end of chapter 1 and 2 as such. We're going to remember in our prayer tonight Brother David Payton. Brother Payton, you might remember, is a preacher at Lafayette and is suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease and is making evidently some progress there. Brother Rick was telling me that he's hoping to be able to return and teach a class here, which would be amazing, wouldn't it? It really would. And so, do what? Has he been preaching already? Well, that's amazing. That's amazing. So we appreciate David and his, I call it grit. I don't know what you folks call it. I just call it grit. And that says, I ain't out till I'm out. So there you go. We're going to ask Reggie, if he don't mind, a word of prayer for us. Anyone else we need to be mindful of in our prayer? Would you mind, Reggie? Appreciate it, brother.
Heavenly Father, we're so thankful to be able to call you our Father. And we know that all of our blessings come from thee, the life, and the hope of eternal life through your Son, Jesus Christ, and his blood that was shed upon the cross. We're so much thankful for the teachers this evening that have prepared their lessons and are ready to instruct us in more better understanding of thy word, because we know the importance of knowing and understanding the Bible, that we can be pleasing unto thee. We're also thankful for the students that are here, that are giving their time and desire to learn more from thee. Also are mindful of those that would love to be here but are at home confined or in hospitals or at work or different situations. But we pray, Heavenly Father, that much good will continue to be done from the school here. We ask your blessings on each of us. In Christ's name we pray.
Amen. Amen. If I mentioned the book of Ezra, what's a general thought that comes to your mind about it when you say Ezra? What are we talking about in the book of Ezra? Well, there's a queen there, but Ezra. Going back a little bit before we get started up to Esther. Ezra. Talking about Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther in this particular course. So when somebody mentions the book of Ezra, what is it that kind of comes to mind at the forefront? Return. That's a great way to put it, Carla. Return for Jerusalem. And they're under what Persian king? Cyrus, king of Persia. And there in return. And about how many came back? Who was the leader of the Israelites on that first return out of captivity back into Judea? Zerubbabel. And about how many came back with him? Right at 50. If you want to get particular, I guess you could probably say 49,497 or something like that, but right at 50,000 people during the process. And then in the latter part of the book of Ezra, we talk about a second return, and this time who is the leader of that return? Ezra, isn't it? And about how many came back with him? Okay, one of the difficulties that I have, you probably don't have it, but I have it, is sometimes trying to keep up with which Persian king is which. For example, when we come into the book of Ezra, in the 4th chapter, we read about 4 or 5 different kings, really. There's Cyrus that we know very well, and then I believe about verse 6 it mentions a fellow by the name of Ahasuerus. And of course, when we mention that name, think of that name, who do we normally think about? Esther. But this is not the same one. This fellow is generally reckoned to be in historical records a fellow by the name of Cambyses. I have no particular mention of him in the Bible other than what's said here in this particular place. So the point being is that Ahasuerus in Ezra chapter 4 when they returned under Ezra, under Zerubbabel, there is not the same one that we read about when we study in the book of Esther. Different one, if you will. And then there's another king in the 4th chapter of the book of Ezra by the name of Artaxerxes. And when we think about Artaxerxes, who do we normally think about? Who was the king when Ezra and Nehemiah came up? Artaxerxes, wasn't it? But this is not the same Artaxerxes. And so it's a different king, if you will. And this fellow sometimes is recognized in history as Pseudo-Smyrtis. And he was a usurper of the throne. He only reigned for about a year, 522, 521 BC, but he's the king to whom the objectors in the land wrote to try to get the work that Zerubbabel and the Israelites were doing on that first return stopped. And were they successful in getting a decree from King Artaxerxes to get the work stopped? They were, weren't they? But that's not the same Artaxerxes that we read about over in the latter part of the book of Ezra, chapter 7, for example. And when Ezra went up in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. So Artaxerxes that we normally think about in the latter part of the book of Ezra and the first part and in Nehemiah reigned from about 465 to 424 BC. And so 465 to 424. Of course, this Artaxerxes in Ezra chapter 4, he dates back to about 522, 21 BC. And so it's a different one. We just kind of have to keep those things clear. And it also said the work was stopped there until another king came forward, and there was a fellow by the name of Tatnai, and who raised the question why the Israelites had started back working again on the temple, and he wrote a letter to the Persian king and made the request that, in accordance with the Israelite statement, that they had a decree from Cyrus back in the days when Cyrus was king. And that decree said that they not only could go forth, but the Persian government really would perhaps provide support for them to do so in the process. And so that king searched the records, and guess what? They found the decree of Cyrus, didn't they? And so this king was a fellow by the name of Darius the First. And so he gave orders that the work should begin and nobody should stop it again in the process. And so the work was completed around what year? The temple being built. 500 and... I've got the number, Sister Carmen, of 16 in my head. Is that about right? 516? So around 516. How long did it take them to do that work then, Sister Carmen? 20 years altogether. And so they had to stop for several years. There was a couple of prophets that was raised up and came to them in the days when the work was stopped at the decree of this first Artaxerxes, Pseudo-Smyrtis, there. They stopped it apparently for around 16 years in the process. Then there was a couple of prophets that came forth and stirred the people up. And who were those prophets? Who?
The ones that stirred them up for good or bad?
For good.
Haggai and Zechariah.
Haggai and Zechariah. Kind of give a picture of that. Let's take just a minute to look at a point or two in the first chapter of the book of Haggai while you're holding your place there. And that is, gives you a little bit better picture, or an increased picture, I guess, might be one way of putting it. And Hosea, Joel, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, And that's the way I have to do it. I don't know how you go about it. Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah. Haggai is one of them big old long books. It's got 2 chapters in it, about a page. Well, let's see, 2 pages. Got two pages there, so that's quite a bit. But notice what it says in the book of Haggai there. In the 2nd year of whom? Darius, 6th month. That would date that time about 520 BC, the 6th month there. Came the word of the Lord, verse 1, by Haggai the prophet unto Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Josedech, the high priest. Verse 2, thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, this people say, the time is not come that the Lord's house should be built. And the reason they were saying that, because they had a decree from that earlier Artaxerxes, or that Smerdis, that usurper, and that not should be built. But then came the word of the Lord by Haggai, said, is it time for you, O ye, to dwell in your what? Sealed houses, and this house lie waste. And so the people were there. They were dwelling there. They were dwelling in their sealed houses, which means, I guess, they'd done the repair work on them, everything else. But God's house is lying waste, if you will. So consider your ways. And with the encouragement of Haggai and then Zechariah, the Israelites returned to the work, and they finish that great work of not only just laying the foundation, but finishing the temple in the city of Jerusalem. Great and wonderful event, if you will, in the process. Now, if I turn my thoughts to the book of Nehemiah, what is it that kind of comes to the forefront when I think about the book of Nehemiah? Building a wall, isn't it? So Esther, you're talking about building the temple, restoring the worship, and in the book of Nehemiah, you're talking about building the wall. What wall is he going to be building? One around Jerusalem, is he not? And so, and Nehemiah had a particular job working for, what king did he work under, live under, serve under? The Persian king was Artaxerxes. Now this is the better Artaxerxes, okay? This is the later one in there. And Artaxerxes, he was the, what work did he have with Artaxerxes? What was his job? He was a cupbearer, which means he had direct access to the king. He had complete confidence and trust of the king, because only one who had those qualities would be one who would be allowed to serve as the king's cupbearer. And Nehemiah, of course, had received news through some who had came back from Judah, and he asked about things, and they told him the condition of the land. How did that impact Nehemiah? Sad, 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 wasn't it? In fact, he couldn't hide his sadness, and when he would go in to serve the king recognized something's not normal with Nehemiah, and he asked him about it, and Nehemiah told him. And then the Persian king, favorable toward Nehemiah and the things of God, asked what he could do, and Nehemiah made the request that he could go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the wall and restore the city of his father's sepulchres, where his ancestors had been buried, if you will, in the process. So Nehemiah returns and builds that wall in the process. And so we get through the first 6, really 7 chapters of the book of Nehemiah, and it has to do with that. Any opposition to building the wall? A lot of opposition, didn't? A lot of opposition to it in the process, and so, but they got it built. And again, I think we said about 52 days in the process of getting that wall built. So look at your study questions for just a moment, if you don't mind, and see if I can find mine, and we'll be in business. At the end of chapter 1, we have 3 discussion questions. I won't just mention those, and then we're going to get right on up into our lesson. We'll be all right today on it. What about the book of Esther? Chapter 1 speaks about the queen at that particular time of the king. Who's the king, by the way, in the days of Esther? Ahasuerus, isn't it? And Ahasuerus, his reign was from about 486 to 465. He was the king before King Artaxerxes, which means the events in the book of Ezra took place before the events, well, I can't say that right, took place before the, I guess, life of Ezra and such there, but because Ezra and Nehemiah gives record, the historical record of the deliverance of the Israelites out of captivity. So that came before Esther, or about to become before Esther. So anyway, Ahasuerus, 486, 465 BC in the process. And he had a queen whose name was Vashti. He had a big party. How long did that party last? 180-day feast, wasn't it? Philip says that's what you call putting on the dog, Joshua. that's what you call going all out in the process. And of course he had all the princes of the 127 provinces present on that occasion, and he showed to them all his great power and wealth and that. And then he called Vashti in so the people could see his queen and asked her to come in. What did Vashti say? No, thank you. I'm not coming. And we made a note last week, I believe the Targum, the Jewish Targum, said that they asked her to come in unclothed, naked is the word that they have in the Targum. And so so if that's the case, you have to commend her, at least for her willing to come, and in the process. So why are the actions of Vashti commendable? Discussion number 1 under chapter 1. Yeah. She refused to be belittled and ogled. I like the way you put that, Carl. And she said, you know, this is not, number 1, it's not becoming the one who's the queen of the country. And if it's not becoming one who's the queen of the country, it's really not becoming the one who's the king. Because her actions and her reputation, I guess, is going to have some reflection upon him. There was a problem going on in the process of this feast here. And one of the problems that Ahasuerus had in his behavior was he'd been partaking of what? Too much alcohol, strong drink, and pride. That had some effect upon Ahasuerus' behavior in the process. Did everybody at that feast, were everybody required to drink those things? No. How many do you suppose said thanks but no thanks to the alcohol? Not many, most likely, if everything goes according to normal. So, anyway, what about good advisors in the government's rule? The advisors, what advice did the governors in the government there? What advice did Ahasuerus' counselors give to it? Yeah, got to quit. This has got to be nipped in the bud in a hurry. And said, if you don't do something, king, and who else in the kingdom is going to rise up against their husbands? All the wives are going to be doing that in the process. And so, and as a result of that, what happened to Vashti? Yeah, she was by a Persian decree. She was refused from ever coming back into the presence of the king. I know she just bawled her eyes out over that, so I've been a little facetious. I don't know that, so anyway. But at least she was still alive. You give her credit, you know that. In chapter 2, it talks about the idea where Esther was selected to become the queen and there to take her place because the counselors of the king, you know, suggested that they would go and they would search out throughout the kingdom all the young, beautiful virgins, and they would come to the capital there and be put in the care of a fellow by the name of Hegai or Hegai or Hegi, depending on which way you want to pronounce it in the process there. And then they would go into the king, and the king would make a selection who is going to become the queen over the nation there in the process. Well, our discussion question says, why do you think Mordecai would want Esther to become queen? Yeah. You know, I would like to know more about Mordecai. I don't know about you. It seems as though his position was one pretty close to the king. He was in the gate, the king's gate, which means that he had some place of degree of prominence. Just what all was involved in that, I really don't know in the process, but it did have to do with control of events, apparently, of those who would or would not or could not come into the king, and that sort of thing, and what could take place in that particular place, if you will. And so he had quite a bit of wisdom, if you will. And what about Esther's identity, race-wise? Did they tell what people is she from? Did they tell that? Why didn't they tell the king that, you know, this lady you picked over here is a Jew? Yeah. So she would have been a captive-made queen, wouldn't she? Which she actually anyway. And what about this idea of Mordecai sitting in the king's gate? What do you think about that? Do I? Number 3, what's the significance of Mordecai sitting in the king's gate? Do what, Mormon? Yeah. It did indicate that Mordecai was a man who had some degree of what? Employment, recognition, importance in the process, and so there you will. Now then, so Esther is queen, and we're introduced to a fellow in chapter 3, and the fellow says, you know, you could live a long time and get along without having to get to know this fellow, but we're going to be introduced to him. And who is it that's introduced to us in chapter 3 of the book of Esther? The bad fella. Fellow by the name of Haman. Haman. So let's look at that chapter 3 for just a few moments here in the process there. We looked at the early part of it last week. And there. Haman had a problem. And he had been promoted. The king had promoted him to what position? Yeah, he was over all the other princes in the 127 provinces as such. Let's see just exactly how it's worded in that place there. Verse 1, chapter 3, these things did King Ahasuerus, after these things did the king promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And so Haman has been promoted, and all the princes would be people who also had positions of prominence and leadership and duties and responsibility as far as carrying out the government and round about them. And all the king's servants, verse 2, that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman. He liked that? Oh, yeah, he really liked that, didn't he, there? And why? Well, the king had commanded concerning him, somebody didn't bow. Who was that somebody? Mordecai. Not, why didn't he bow to the, you know, what's the big deal? Do what, Carmen? Yeah. So he's going to give his bowing down to the God of heaven. So we aren't told explicitly why Mordecai did not do it, other than the fact that he was a Jew, which would indicate that his would perhaps have quite a bit to do with that. And of course, the fact that he was in the gate would be the fact that makes him a servant of the king there, if you will. And in fact, he being in the gate, then that makes him I guess, politically responsible, or to bow down and to abide by the protocol of those who were the king's servants in the gates and that. But Mordecai he's not going to do that. And so the king's servants, when they come to him, they say to Mordecai, verse 3, why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Mordecai, what do you mean not obeying the king here? And so, how often did they do that according to verse 4? Daily, didn't it? So he just finally gave in and started doing it, right? No, that's not right. Hearken not, they told that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for they had told them that he was a Jew. And so these matters, by implication, indicate that something had to do with the fact that he was a Jew, and would have something to do with his reasoning in the process of doing that. So how'd Haman take that verse 5? Not too good, did he? He didn't take it too good, and so he was full of wrath. And in fact, not only is he full of wrath, he kind of a good illustration of what wrath will do here, because then he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. And so now, since they've said, Haman over here is Mordecai's people, and old Haman's wrath, anger is against this Jew, Mordecai. And so he said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just go out and do what? Get rid of all of them. Destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. Now, we aren't told explicitly in the context whether or not the other Jews round about were bowing down and reverencing Haman like they said, but it would seem to indicate that probably they were what? Were or were not? Probably, so Mordecai's influence is going to be that which at least perhaps in the mind of Haman is going to spread, and so it's going to lessen his egotistical view of himself in the process there. So drop down to about verse 7, talks about in the first month, that's the month Nisan, 12th year of the king Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman from day to day, and from month to month, and to the 12th month, that is the month of Adar as such in that. So casting pur, casting lot, what are they doing that for? What are they trying to find out? They're going to find a date. And of course, the historians tell us this is one of the ways when some special event would take place, that they to find a beginning point, and this is perhaps they would go about doing it in the process and there. So, and day to day. So, well, Haman, of course, is going to have some authority. So, beginning about verse 8, he's going to go in and talk to the king about this matter. He tells him tell about a certain people scattered abroad, verse 8, dispersed among the people in all the province of thy kingdom. It says, their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. True or false, what Haman said to the king? No, not true. And so it says, half-truths don't get the job. Did the Jews have a law? Yeah, they had a law from God, didn't they, in process? Now, were they in disobedience to the king of the Persian king? No. No indication that they were that at all. In fact, they were being highly favored by the Persian king under which they lived, and there. So, different law, wasn't it? So, yeah. And so Haman put the Jewish people in the worst possible light that he could in the process, and said it's not for the king's profit to suffer them. And so the king went ahead and made a writing that the Jewish people would be what, according to verse 9? The word is destroyed. And look at what old Haman says. You know, the king says, I'll pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of this business to bring it into the king's treasury. Now, why in the world would this man 10,000 talents of silver? Haman was not a poor boy, was he? And no. In our notes here it says this is estimated to be perhaps 375 tons of silver. I mean, fella says you can go down to the Hardee's all day long on that, Joe. And all that. That's a lot of silver. Why do you suppose he would make that decree? This is your thoughts. What's going to happen to the economy in the land when all of the Jews are put to death and taken out of the economy? Jewish people working people or not working people? Working people, weren't they? Did they provide an integral part of the general society and culture of that day and age? Probably did. And I suppose they probably paid taxes like everybody else there in the process. So Haman says, well, you don't have to worry about losing anything, King. I'm going to make it. And it may be, I'll underline may be, it may be that the enormous amount that Haman promised to pay is that which would do two things. Number one, it would compensate that which the king would lose by the process. And at the same time, it probably also could be indicative of the fact that those who came in to slay and to kill the Jews, what happens to all their possessions and goods and monies and things? That's the spoil, isn't it? And so they're going to get some of that back in the process too. Wonderful thoughts. It would. Yeah. And so Haman says, King says, I'll take care of you, doesn't he? So he puts him in good light with the king Ahasuerus there. And so, well, does the king give that decree?
Yep.
He does, doesn't he? And not only that, he who did he give authority to go ahead and write the decree out? And what did he give Haman to seal that decree? Verse 10, he gave him his ring, didn't he? And so the silver is given to thee, the people to do with them as it seemeth good to thee in the process. So Haman's going to come up with some monies too in some form or fashion there in the process. So, well, the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman commanded, under the king's lieutenants, the governors, over all the provinces. And so the every people of every province, according to the writing, to the every people after the language, in the name, latter part of verse 12, in the name of King Ahasuerus was it written and sealed with the king's fee. Any lack of communicating what's going to take place? But it says anybody that's anybody anywhere knows what's going to take place now, don't they? What about all the Jews? Do they know what's going to take place? Yeah. How would we like to have been a Jew living in that day and age and get word passed down to the king? So, you know, on the 13th day of the 12th month, that's it. And that's what they had to look forward. And so here's what they were authorized to do, verse 13. Destroy, kill, cause to perish all, A-L-L, all Jews, young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for prey. And so a copy of this writing was to be in every province, published unto all the people that they should be ready against that day. The post went out, the mailman does, verse 15, being hastened by the king's commandment. And the decree was given in Shushan, the palace. And it says the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city Shushan was what? What do you reckon it means that they were perplexed?
They couldn't understand why that was being decreed.
What in the world is going on here in our society that the king puts out a decree here that he's going to destroy one complete race of people all in one day? And like what, Mark? Yeah. Jews hadn't done anything, had they? Yeah. Yeah. Sit down and drink. Yeah. Big time get together, going to celebrate and all that stuff, if you will, in the process, and there. So, decrees drawn up, sent to all the province, all the Jews be destroyed on the 13th day of the 12th month in the process. and the people in Shushan was delivered. Come to chapter 4, and come back to Mordecai. Esther. And where is Esther? She's in the king's palace, isn't she? She's the queen. Mordecai, he perceived all was done. Impact on him, rent his clothes, sackcloth of ashes, went out into the midst of the city, and cried with a loud and bitter cry. And so he mourned openly, publicly, and came even before the king's gate. That's where he was, and none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And Mordecai probably been one who enforced that policy from time to time, being in the king's gate. Every province, whithersoever the king's commandment, his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, fasting, weeping, wailing, many lay in sackcloth and ashes. And so Esther, back up in her internal domain there, her maid and her chamberlains came and told her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved. And so to whom does she send requests? Verse 4. As she sent raiment to Mordecai. Mordecai, take away your sackcloth. Mordecai glad to receive her clothing? No, he rejected it. And Esther called one of her servants, a fellow by the name of Hatak, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to stand to attend upon her, and gave him a commandment, took Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. Hatak, you go to Mordecai and you find out what this is and why it is. And so he goes forth to Mordecai, verse 6, into the street of the city. That's where Mordecai was, before the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. In fact, it says he even gave him a copy of what, verse 8? Of the writing, or the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and declare it unto her, and charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication, make request before him for her people. One thing the king was not yet aware of is this decree that he put out that all the Jews were to be killed on this day. That would include who? His wife, Esther, wouldn't it? He didn't know she was a Jew, but that would come to bear. You got to like Esther. She was sharp. She was sharp. Hatak comes to Esther, tells the words of Mordecai. Well, verse 10, again, Esther speaks unto Hatak, gave him a commandment to Mordecai, going back again. All the king's servants, the people of the king's provinces, do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king in the inner court, who is not called, there's one law of his, and that's to do what? Put him to death. Mordecai, you've asked me to go in and intercede to the king for us. You need to be reminded that anybody, man or woman, goes in there who's not called, the penalty is death in the process there. One law there. And then she tells him, latter part of verse 11, I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. Well, they tell Mordecai Esther's words. Mordecai is going to send word back. What words he send back in verse 13? Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape the king's house more than all the Jews. Esther, don't think just because you're in the king's house you're going to escape more than any other Jews. If you altogether hold your peace at this time, then what's going to happen? There shall enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from where? Another place. Tells us quite a bit about Mordecai, doesn't it? Mordecai have confidence in his God? Obviously did. Esther, if you don't go and intercede for your people here, so somebody else will do it in the process. And if you hold your peace there, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And the statement that we remember so often in the book of Esther, the latter part of verse 14, says, Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And so Esther sends answer back to Mordecai. That go gather all the Jews that are present in Shushan. Fast ye from me, neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai went his way, did all that Esther commanded him. So here's Esther putting her life on the line, as we say sometimes in the process, in a very significant way. And that's so. Esther's going to find favor with the king in chapter 5. And that's so. Third, have you ever thought about the handmaidens of Esther? Esther comes in and says, now we're going to fast for 3 days. And they might scratch their head and say, why? But no indication they did that. So they did it. Third day, Esther put on her royal apparel, stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. The king sat up on his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And so when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained what in his sight? Favor. Wonder what the difference would be if Esther went over there, rather than being in her royal apparel, she just gone over there in her everyday apparel as such. Reckon be any difference as such? Why would she put on her royal apparel? Yeah, it'll be. But she says, I'm going to give it my best shot in the process, so that's what she does. And it makes a difference. It makes a difference sometimes how we present ourselves in the process. Here am I, send me? Yeah. Here am I, send me. Okay, very good. Well, she finds favor, she draws near and touches the top of the scepter. The king holds out his golden scepter. Esther goes up and touches it, which means she is now with favor in the presence of the king in the process there. And so the king asks her a question. What wilt thou, Queen Esther? Wonder why he would ask a question like that. He knew that there was something on her mind pretty serious, wasn't it? Otherwise, she wouldn't be there in that fight. Do what, Greg? She wouldn't risk her life. And so, Esther, what is it? What is it in the process there? And what is thy request? And it shall be given thee. How much? To half of the kingdom. And so here's a king who had promise. That reminds us of a fellow in the New Testament, doesn't it? Not as favorably as it does with Esther. Who was it? Oh, Herod, wasn't it, Brother Greg? And his daughter-in-law did the dance before him, and he said, you can have whatever you, up to half the kingdom. Of course, what was her request? The head of John the Baptist, wasn't it? In the process. And so here's what she requests. Now, Haman, if that fellow doesn't have a prayer from this point on, Esther's the one that's going to be in charge of things. And you just got to appreciate it. She says, if it's good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet I prepared for him. The king said, cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet. Esther had prepared. The king said to Esther the banquet, verse 6, what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. What she requests, even the half of the kingdom. And verse 7, Esther said, what? My petition, my request is what? Hey, got another one set up for you tomorrow. That's my petition. It says, you come back tomorrow, you and Haman, and I'll tell you what my request is. So, and if I found favor in thy sight, and if it please the king to grant my petition, verse 8, and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said. Well, very quickly Haman went forth that day. He goes home with a glad heart, sees old Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he stood not up, and it was full of indignation against Mordecai. Mordecai just ruined that fellow's day, didn't he? Haman going out there, and he wouldn't stand up and give him reverence there. But he's on his way home with his heart otherwise sort of lifted up. He refrained himself, went home, called all of his friends, and Zeresh, that's his wife, verse 10, told them of his glory of his riches and of the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. He gave an updated report of all the king had done for him. You think they didn't know most of this already? Why, yeah, he bragging. Yeah. So Haman said, Yea, Ester the queen, did no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she prepared but myself. The queen prepared a banquet today, and the only one that came into the banquet besides the king was myself. And he says, not only this, he says, tomorrow I'm also invited in with the king. However, verse 13, that means nothing to me as long as I see somebody in the king's gate. And that's Mordecai. Zeresh has the answer to his problem. And Zeresh's wife, all his friends, says, let a gallows be built 50 cubits high. I guess that'd be tall enough to get the job done. Tomorrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon, and go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be built. The fellow says, what's that old saying, give a fellow enough rope and he'll do what? I believe Haman got plenty of rope out there right now, don't you? We'll pick up, dear folks, next Monday night, beginning chapter 6. So let's close with prayer. Thank you, O God, for the day and blessings from your hand, and allowing us to be together here at this time to study your great and your holy word. Thank you for service of the days of old, like Esther and Mordecai and your faithful servants who have lived and served you in such difficult circumstances at times. Give us courage and wisdom to always stand for that which is right in your sight. Is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. 9 till afternoon, Bridgeport, this coming Saturday, Central Daylight Time, and okay.